All right, this is the fourth presentation in our series on art and spirituality. So far, we have explored truth, goodness, and beauty. Today, we arrive at wisdom. And I want to begin, as I have in previous weeks, with a question. What is the difference between intelligence and wisdom? What is the difference between intelligence and wisdom? Well, I think most of us feel we know the difference when we encounter it. We have all met people of brilliant intellect who seem, in some fundamental way, rather lost. They can analyze for sure, and they can argue. They can outperform anyone in the room on a test, but we wouldn't go to them necessarily when life breaks open or when life breaks down. We would not trust them with our deepest questions, our most consequential dilemmas. And we have also met people who could not begin to match them intellectually, who've never read Kant or learned calculus, and yet there's something about them. When they speak, we slow down. When they look at us, we feel genuinely seen. When they make a decision, somehow it holds. That something in them is wisdom. And it is rarer, more costly, and I'd say more beautiful than intelligence. And it is also, I want to suggest today, more urgently needed. Now, I'd like to make one central argument this morning, and everything we look at will reinforce it. I think the single greatest obstacle to wisdom is a narrow perspective. And the single greatest invitation to wisdom is the willingness to broaden one's view again and again, across traditions, across centuries, across the full complexity of human experience. Great art is one of the most powerful instruments the human race has ever produced for exactly that kind of broadening. You see, art moves us outside our own time. Art moves us outside our own tribe, our own assumptions. It places before us the faces of strangers who become, if we look long enough, versions of ourselves. So let's look carefully today, because wisdom may be closer than we think. For those of us raised in the Western tradition, which I believe is most of us, wisdom begins with Solomon. In the Hebrew Bible, Solomon's prayer at Gibeon is among the most moving requests ever recorded. Asked by God what he wishes for, Solomon does not ask for the typical wealth or military power or a long life. He asks for a listening heart. The desire for wisdom, I believe, is quite rare. People will gladly pursue and even pay handsomely for things like beauty, significance, security, hits of dopamine, love, and even hope, especially hope. But I don't see a desire for wisdom nearly as strong. In fact, some even avoid gaining wisdom, for it might mean sacrificing the pursuit of those desirable things I just mentioned. In this work, the Queen of Sheba questions Solomon to tease forth wisdom. Wisdom often depends on relationship, on dialogue, give and take with others who have different knowledge and different experiences and perspectives than we do. And in the Jewish tradition, wisdom is not primarily a mental faculty, it is relational, it is moral. It is the capacity to discern what is true, what is right, and what is needed in a particular situation before us. Discerning such wisdom often requires an invitation to the perspective of others. Here's something else. Wisdom in the Hebrew imagination is not merely a human achievement. It is participation in something larger, something cosmic. To grow in wisdom is to grow in alignment with the deep structure of reality itself. Now, notice the title of this work. Believe it or not, it is a ceiling fresco in the Borgia apartment within the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican. You see, this work was commissioned by Pope Alexander VI. It depicts the transmission of divine wisdom from the ancient Egyptian world into both the Judeo-Christian tradition, represented by Moses, and the Hellenic tradition, represented by Hermes. Apparently, at one time, even leaders of the church believed that wisdom should be sought wherever it originated, regardless of whether it came from a different religion or a different culture. And the Western tradition is equally clear about where wisdom begins. Not in a particular philosophy, not even in an experience, or even virtue exactly, but in what the tradition calls the fear of the Lord. Now, that phrase may sound strange to modern ears, but its meaning is more nuanced than straight up terror in the presence of a deity. It really means awe. It means the recognition that reality is fantastically larger than we are, that we do not have the final word. That kind of humility before what is real is the beginning of all genuine knowing. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, states Proverbs 9:10. And that verse, in some form, appears in nearly every wisdom tradition in the world. Ah, yes, this fresco again. Well, this time I'm not zooming in on Plato and Aristotle. Now, we did use this work in our presentation on truth, where we focused on the dialogue between Plato and Aristotle at the center. Today, though, I want to look at the totality of the human interaction. Raphael's great fresco is one of the supreme images of the Western intellectual tradition. This is a painting about the breadth of wisdom. Raphael has gathered into one impossible space philosophers from across centuries, across schools, across irreconcilable disagreements. They are not here because they agreed. They are here because they were willing to think. Wisdom, Raphael seems to be saying, is not the property of any single school. It is the fruit of sustained conversation across many perspectives. Now, for those of us in the Western tradition, trained in that tradition, Socrates remains probably the most extraordinary figure in the history of wisdom. The story of the Delphic oracle declaring him the wisest man in Athens is, properly understood, the founding story of Western philosophy. Socrates interpreted the oracle's declaration this way: I am wiser than others only because I know what I do not know. Every other person, when challenged, pretends to know what they do not. Socrates would say, I at least have this advantage. I am under no illusion about my own understanding. Now, in this painting, we see Socrates learning from Aspasia, a great woman philosopher of antiquity. Socrates did not allow the prejudices of a patriarchal culture to impede his journey to know and understand. Wisdom begins with the recognition of one's own limit. As in the Hebrew tradition, wisdom begins with humility. For Aristotle, wisdom was the virtue that governed the exercise of all other virtues. A courageous person without wisdom becomes reckless. A just person without wisdom applies justice badly. A generous person without wisdom squanders their generosity on the wrong people or the wrong causes. Wisdom, then, is the intelligence that discerns how to live well, not in the abstract, but here, now, in this particular situation, with these particular people, given these constraints. Rome gave wisdom a political and civic dimension that Greece had not fully developed. For the Stoics, their philosophy deeply shaped Roman culture. For these Stoics, wisdom was inseparable from the question of how to live well within a community. Marcus Aurelius, soldier, emperor, and philosopher, understood wisdom as the daily practice of asking. Things like, what does this situation actually require of me? What is within my power? What is not? And where is the good? His book, Meditations, written not for publication but as a private discipline, were an exercise in particularizing and pragmatizing wisdom while he was under extreme pressure. The Roman concept of prudentia, from which our word prudence derives, was the practical wisdom required not only of philosophers, but of statesmen, generals, and citizens. Wisdom in the Roman imagination had to be livable. It had to be applicable. It had to govern real decisions with real consequences. All right, we move now across the world and across to a very different way of thinking about wisdom. In the Buddhist tradition, the Sanskrit word for wisdom is prajna. And prajna is among the most important concepts in the entire Buddhist philosophical and spiritual vocabulary. Prajna is not the accumulation of information. It is the direct perception of things as they actually are. Our default state, according to this tradition, is not one of accurate perception. We do not see reality for what it actually is. And that misperception begins with our self-understanding. Wisdom, in the Buddhist sense, begins with the recognition that the self we are so busy protecting and promoting and defending is not quite what we think it is. It is not a fixed, independent entity. We are, in fact, a process. Our self is relational. It is, in the deepest sense, empty of the kind of solidity we project onto it. Once we recognize that the rigid, defended self is somewhat illusory, then wisdom becomes possible. The wisdom of genuine compassion, genuine presence, genuine openness to what is actually here. The Bodhisattva ideal in Mahayana Buddhism is one of the most beautiful expressions of wisdom in any tradition. A bodhisattva is one who has arrived at the threshold of nirvana, the highest form of enlightenment, release from this world and all its restraints, but who turns back out of compassion for all beings still suffering. Now, this is not quite sacrifice in the Western sense. It is the natural expression of prajna, wisdom. Because if we have truly perceived the interconnectedness of all beings, we cannot draw a clean line between our liberation, our salvation, and that of all other people. The Buddhist tradition insists that wisdom cannot be transmitted by words alone. It must be cultivated through practice, through meditation, through the direct examination of one's own mind. And here is the central lesson for our purposes today. Wisdom in the Buddhist tradition is fundamentally about the broadening and ultimately the dissolution of the narrow, defended, fearful perspective of the small self. This is the wider the view, means the wider the view, the deeper the wisdom. Let me say that again. The wider the view, the deeper the wisdom. So contemplative practice in the Buddhist tradition is the training of perspective broadening. When we sit in meditation, we're not emptying the mind. We are learning to hold our thoughts, fears, prejudices, and fixed ideas more lightly. We are training the capacity to step back from the automatic habitual contractions of the ego and see, even briefly, from a wider place. This is wisdom training. And while the Buddhist tradition has developed it with particular rigor, the impulse toward contemplative broadening appears in virtually every major tradition. Van Gogh's devastating painting of an old man bent over in grief is one of the most honest images of human suffering in the history of art. I include it here because wisdom in the modern therapeutic and psychological tradition is inseparable from the capacity to hold suffering, one's own suffering and others, without collapsing under it or fleeing from it. Erik Erikson, one of the founders of developmental psychology, identified wisdom as the virtue of the final stage of human development. He defined it as the informed and detached concern with life itself in the face of death itself. That phrase, informed and detached, is extraordinarily precise. Wisdom does not mean indifference. It does not mean emotional numbness. It means the capacity to remain engaged, caring, and present, even while holding the full weight of our mortalities and limitations. Marc Chagall's luminous dreamscape brings together the memories of his Russian Jewish childhood, the traditions of his community, the face of an animal, and a floating kaleidoscopic world in which time moves freely in multiple directions. It is a painting about the wisdom of belonging, of rootedness in a tradition, rich enough to sustain the imagination across generations. I think the modern world is, in some ways, a wisdom desert. Not because we lack intelligence or information, but because we have severed so many of the connections that wisdom requires. Connection to a community, connection to a tradition, connection to a contemplative practice, connection to the natural world, and connection to our own mortality. Wisdom is not possible in complete isolation from these sources. It requires the matrix of a life embedded in something larger than itself. Now, a work like this, painting, is an invitation to tap into our own histories, our own spiritual traditions, to explore again with renewed fascination what originally formed who we are. Holbein's painting is one of the most intellectually complex works, I think, in Western art history. At first glance, it is a portrait of two wealthy, competent, accomplished men surrounded by the instruments of their power and learning. Globes, musical instruments, scientific tools, books. The Renaissance world of knowledge and achievement displayed with pride. But across the bottom of the painting lies an object that rewards patient attention. Do you see what I'm talking about? It is an anamorphic skull, a skull painted in distorted perspective that only resolves into its true form when viewed from a particular angle at the far right of the painting. When you step aside and look askance, the skull snaps into focus. The meaning is plain. All this achievement, all this learning, all this confidence is confronted and challenged by mortality. The perspective that reveals what the painting is really about requires us to shift our position. And that's the central argument of today's presentation. Wisdom requires the willingness to shift position, to step outside our normal angle of vision, to see what can only be seen from a different place. Every tradition we have examined so far today agrees on this. The Hebrew tradition requires the recognition that I am not God. The Greek tradition requires the Socratic acknowledgement of ignorance. The Buddhist tradition requires the dissolution of the fixed, defended self. Renaissance and more modern expressions confirm it. The desire for wisdom is the willingness to examine, challenge, and periodically revise one's own perspective. El Greco's famous cityscape is not really a realistic depiction of Toledo. First of all, the light's all wrong, and the storm appears as apocalyptic. The city seems about to be consumed by something beyond human control. El Greco is showing us the city of Toledo not as a surveyor would see it, but as a person of deep faith and spiritual intensity would feel it. Fragile, provisional, suspended between time and eternity, flowing through an active memory like a river. Wisdom is always partially about this, seeing what is merely human within a larger, more mysterious frame. Now, the city is real, the buildings stand, but they stand within something larger. They are illuminated and shadowed by a light that does not come from the sun. The wise person is one who can hold simultaneously the particular and the universal, the personal and the cosmic. That requires a perspective spacious enough to contain all of those dimensions at once. And that kind of perspective is not natural to any of us. It must be cultivated. It must be chosen. It must be practiced. Now, Van Gogh painted this in July 1890, shortly before his death. The wheat field is golden and turbulent at the same time. The sky is an alarming saturated blue. 3 paths lead into the field, and I'm not sure any of those paths end with an exit. The crows emerge from the grain, dark and agitated. There's a lot of debate about whether this is a despairing painting or a painting of stormy vitality. Perhaps the answer is that it is both, and that holding that ambiguity without resolving it is itself a kind of wisdom. The wheat that we see is real and abundant. The sky is real and threatening. The paths are real, and some of them may lead nowhere. And over all of it, the world keeps moving. Wisdom does not end with resolution, and that's difficult for us to accept. It does not require a tidy conclusion. It lives in the capacity to remain present to complexity, to ambiguity, to the irreducible tension between beauty and suffering, between meaning and mystery, without collapsing into either despair or false certainty. Once again, we will close with Caspar David Friedrich's solitary figure, standing before the vast light of the sun. Just like this woman, wisdom asks that we become receptive, that we develop the capacity to be genuinely present to what is actually here in all its complexity, in all its beauty, in all its difficulty, all its depth. We began today with the question, what is the difference between intelligence and wisdom? I hope that after this morning's journey, the answer has become a little more textured. Intelligence operates within a framework. Wisdom questions the framework. Intelligence solves problems. Wisdom discerns which problems are worth solving. Intelligence analyzes. Wisdom knows when to stop analyzing and simply be present. And wisdom, as every tradition we have visited today insists, is not a destination, but it is a direction. It is the ongoing practice of broadening one's perspective, of sitting with what we do not yet understand, of encountering the strange, the suffering, the unfamiliar tradition, the difficult text, and allowing it to change us. Friends, that is the invitation before us this morning. To take one more step in the direction of genuine seeing. To look at the art before us, the people beside us, all the lives around us, with a willingness to be changed by what we find.